I'll just kick it off since I started talking. So I'm Amy. I'm from the Cardinal and Labakan families in Treaty 8 territory. So my family's from Owl River Pieces Band and the Labakan settlement. And I currently live in Rocky Mountain House in Treaty 6 territory. And I'm an Indigenous fire specialist with Parks Canada at the moment. So I will pass it to Paul. Paul, you have no sound either. There you go.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Paul Coutre. I'm from the Gift Lake Métis settlement. I'm a bilingual wildfire ranger of 45 years experience with wildland firefighting. I got into firefighting at a very young age because my dad was involved in some of my other family. So it's been an interesting career, and I've had a lot of varied experiences with wildfire, and it's still going. But I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to be part of this conversation on evacuations, because I feel it's important for our communities to be involved with the discussion. I recently, last year I was nominated for the Wildland Firefighter honor in Edmonton, and that was a great honor. Thank you.
Okay, Tara, maybe.
Thanks, Amy. My name's Tara McGee. I'm a professor and associate dean at the University of Alberta here in Treaty 6 territory in the Misquitchie, Waskagan, Edmonton. I lead the Human Dimensions of Hazards research group, of which Amy used to be a member years ago. I've been doing wildfire social science research for about 25 years. And it was an enormous pleasure it has been and still is an enormous pleasure to co-lead the First Nations Wildfire Evacuation Partnership together with Amy. Thank you.
Awesome. And I'm just going to say, because Fran is joining us. Yeah, that's a lot better. So Fran is joining us with just audio only because she's on the road. So I'll just give her a quick introduction. So Fran comes to this panel with 24 years of First Nations emergency management. And the last 8 years, Fran has been, so it's Fran Byers, as the First Nations Field Operations Manager at Alberta Emergency Management Agency. So Fran is crucial. She provides crucial support in emergency management pillars of preparedness, mitigation, response, and recovery. And Fran is a really strong community advocate, and she's really passionate about community support. And then Michelle, you can jump in, or I can also give you an introduction right now. I'll just give you an introduction. So Michelle is, she's a trailblazing firefighter and associate director of the Saskatchewan First Nation Emergency Management. Michelle has been a driving force in reshaping the landscape for First Nation and fire emergency management. As the first female president of the Aboriginal Firefighters Association of Canada, Michelle is dedicated to improving the Aboriginal firefighter, the emergency services and training for First Nations communities. So I'd like to thank everybody for their patience on this and just turn it over to Amy for a question to get us started. So Amy, what role do wildfire management agencies play in wildfire evacuations and in repatriation in Canada?
Perfect. So I'll just answer a question coming through both my work team's chat and then the chat here. So I think everyone's asking if they can mute themselves, but I think there's no mute option for the audience, right? I think that's what's come up. So that the noise was on our end. So hopefully it sounds better now. Yeah, so in terms of jurisdiction for evacuations, I mean, it's super complicated across Canada. So different so the federal government basically has no kind of jurisdiction over evacuations. So that is actually through the provinces, through different emergency management agencies or other things, depending on, what's happening in each province and the legislation. So for some, there's emergency management agencies then that can recommend evacuations or be involved in them. For others, it's municipalities, mayors, First Nation chiefs that will call their own evacuations. And I think the complication is when we get First Nations involved, that then the federal jurisdiction also comes in, right? Because First Nation reserves are under federal jurisdiction. And one thing also that we really find is that when we're that the situations kind of get very complicated when First Nations are trying to get information about evacuations and who they should go to receive that kind of information. And so oftentimes when there is a wildfire event that's near a community, they have to make a decision then on whether or not to evacuate. And they often are getting advice from different agencies. And so for wildfire management agencies, like what we heard in our research with Tara and I, when we were trying to get wildfire management agencies involved in this, was that they were just saying like, no, we don't have any role to play here. This isn't our jurisdiction. We're not involved in evacuations. But what we really find is that communities, First Nations, lean very heavily on wildfire management agencies for advice about both evacuations and making that decision, and also repatriation. And I think that there's a big lack of understanding from wildfire agencies about the important role that they do play in evacuations. And as well, like Fran will probably speak to this, but lots of times there's provincial operation centers that are set up for major events that wildfire agencies sit in on, and advice will come through that group too. But I mean, for many communities, like they're not sure, they don't know where the fire is, they don't know what's happening. And so that's where they have a huge reliance on these wildfire management agencies to make these decisions on, what's best and safest for their communities.
Thanks a lot, Amy. I think that really lays the groundwork for why we're here and what we're trying to talk about. And one of the things was that Fran, in Alberta, there is Alberta Wildfire and they're giving advice, but there's also Alberta Emergency Management Agency and Fran's with Alberta Emergency Management Agency. And one of the things is that they're trying to work on getting more community involvement. So, Frank, can you tell us times like when you've had that community involvement in emergency preparedness and how that can make evacuations better? And Fran, I think we've got you, but I'm not hearing you. Okay, well, we'll have to try and sort that out. But right now, I'm just going to jump over to Michelle while we sort out the audio issue here. So, Michelle, in terms of in Saskatchewan, things I think there have been developing and growing and changing over the last couple of years. And can you talk about the relationship between wildfire management agencies and Indigenous communities in Saskatchewan and how they've changed and what we can do to work better together?
Hi, everyone. So one of the biggest changes that I've seen here in Saskatchewan when it comes to that relationship piece is the stand up of a new program. So the biggest changes actually come from Indigenous Services Canada. They started at what's called the Community Enhancement Program, which allowed First Nation communities and tribal councils to hire emergency response coordinators. And that's been a huge game changer for us here in Saskatchewan. The emergency response coordinators are at all tribal councils here in Saskatchewan, and we also have emergency response coordinators at many band levels as well. Another change So with that change came a huge big voice for a tribal council and also for the band, and that was a huge game changer. We also have in our EOCs wildfire staff embedded into our community EOC. So that communication line is very strong between leadership and wildfire staff, going back to what Amy was saying about the communication and the vital information that they hold to help leadership make those decisions. Everybody is around the table hearing the same messaging, and that's very important. As I was saying, the biggest change coming from Indigenous Services Canada, and it's by increasing the First Nation capacity for all of the pillars in emergency management. Right now, we are developing multilateral service agreements that include all partners in decision making, which is huge. Because what we've found going across Canada, if you look at all of the wildfire agreements, you'll see that most, I would say, were just developed between Indigenous Services Canada and the provincial wildfire bodies, with no input from our First Nation communities. And that's starting to change. So I think that's a lot of the relationship building, is wildfire agencies and other orgs are starting to see that First Nations will have the ability to make those choices themselves. It's not a one box fits all anymore. And the Indigenous Services, the EMAP program, Emergency Management Assistance Program, has become more flexible for our First Nation communities. One example is a progress payment for a First Nation community. So they can reach out to Indigenous Service Canada regionally and be able to have a cash advance to manage those emergencies, which there allows that community to take on more responsibility and the needs of their people. And that's been a huge game changer. So with the new way forward, I think bands will decide who their partners are and for what services. And that'll be a huge game changer. And I think everybody is sitting by and waiting and watching. And we're very fortunate here in Saskatchewan to have great partners with Indigenous Services Canada walking with us as we choose this new way forward. And I'm always thankful for that. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. And then I'm going to jump over to Tara right now and just say, Tara, like, you're a researcher in this area, and what insights do you have to make evacuation planning better for Indigenous communities?
Thanks so much, Heather. So I am a researcher. I'm based at the University of Alberta. My research has always been very applied in that I've always worked with fire management agencies, emergency management agencies, with other people, so that the results of my research and our research can be applied and used. So in terms of the First Nations Wildfire Evacuation Partnership, we did produce some academic papers, gave some academic presentations, but also a lot of our, the outcomes from that were community booklets, for example, shared back to the community involved in the research and available to others as well as, of course, our book, which is it certainly does weave in the results of research, but it's also very much focused on leading communities through conversations and thinking around preparedness for evacuations. So lots of insights in the book, to plug that again. Yeah, so lots of insights as part of that.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Tara. And we're going to pop over to Paul here and say, like, from the end of somebody who is actually fighting fire, you're within an agency, and we know that things get really complicated during emergencies and everything's happening so fast. And can you share your experience as a firefighter dealing with these challenges and make some suggestions for improvements?
Yes, thanks. Yeah, no, it's true. Like I do work the front lines, as well as being a community representative for our department. I work with a First Nations community that's directly next to our Métis settlement. So Amy's right about the communication. Like, people do depend on us for answers when things are starting to get really hectic. I get a lot of calls. I get a lot of messages asking me what's going on, where are we, things like that. So uh, I think that if there was community-based people like Michelle was saying that they have in Saskatchewan, if we had those in our communities, there would be that connection to be able to reach out to let them know what information we have. It's very tricky, especially as you say, like when the incident first starts. It's very hectic. Everybody's running all over the place and trying to get their heads around what's going on, trying to establish yourself on the fire, putting equipment and people out there. So if you're getting calls from your community at the same time, it's quite challenging. And yeah, like I said, if we had somebody at the community that can be able to field those calls, it would be a help for sure.
All right, and I'm just going to do a quick sound check, and oh no, Fran's popped out again. So I think we're just Friends had unexpected travel come up, and she's been trying to engage, but I think it's just hard to get her in here. So Amy, I'm going to come back to you and say, like we talked a little bit about, we are kind of talking about jurisdiction here, and in terms of, do things work differently? Is it different between the like IR or Indian Reserve land or First Nations land compared to non-IR land? And when you've come through this, is there any best practices that really stand out for you that you've seen that we could guide people towards?
Sure. So I think, as I mentioned before, like the biggest issue when it comes to evacuations of reserves is that then it involves that federal component. So as Michelle mentioned, like Indigenous Services Canada and things, and Indigenous Services Canada has signed different agreements with different provinces about, how they will respond and support First Nation communities in responding to a wildfire. But it really differs by province. And I would say that many First Nations sometimes aren't even aware of what those agreements are. And so in doing the research for the book, like we found cases where like a local emergency rep for a First Nation who also, was in many communities, it's somebody that wears multiple hats. So they're not just the emergency management coordinator, they're also like a fire chief or a counselor or a community nurse. And it's very difficult for them to keep track of all of these, like for us, we're like employed in wildfire, right? But for them, they're responding to a ton of things in their community. Then they're faced with the wildfire and they're supposed to know exactly what to do with that and, the procedure to follow. And so it's really hard. And so in one case, the people were called, like the emergency manager was trying to call Indigenous Services Canada for help, but he was ignoring like a call that kept coming in from an unknown number. But that was actually from like the provincial emergency manager who was trying to provide assistance. But he was trying to get a hold of Indigenous Services Canada, who wouldn't get back to him. And there was just a lot of confusion about like how to actually go about getting support and getting the community evacuated. Another community that we did research with, Sandy Lake First Nation, what they had to do was they had to make a declaration to Tara, right, of a community emergency before they could then call an evacuation order in order to receive kind of the proper funding and support, but they weren't aware of that. So it just added so many complications when you're already dealing, like Paul said, with stressed people and you're trying to, get them out, evacuate, but then you don't even understand like all these complicated procedures. It's very difficult. And so I would say from what we learned was like, too, there's really this paternalistic attitude still between government agencies and First Nation reserves. And so the one thing that we found like worked the best was that communities know themselves the best. Like they know who in their community needs extra support, how to, get people out of the community that don't have cars, who's diabetic, all these different things. And so if they're supported, within their own capacity, to be able to respond, that's really kind of the best case. And a really good example of that was Stanley Mission. When they evacuated their community, they actually had an incredible process locally for recognizing who needed what. Basically, when they were evacuating, they had in their band hall a series of tables, go to this table if you need support for young children, go to this one if you need this. And they got everybody onto buses or deployed. But where the real confusion with that one started was the second that they evacuated, like 2 hours from their community, and then all the provincial and the federal people started getting involved. And then it got very complicated about, how to provide and get support for people. So yeah, I'll leave it at that if anybody else has anything to add there.
Yeah, and this is where there's a big gap even in this panel, and the big gap in this panel is actually Fran, because Fran really works in this area, and she's been really involved in doing pre-planning and community engagement and providing that support. So Michelle, jump in here if you want.
Sure. I was just going to say, I totally agree with everything that Amy was saying. Our organization, Sask First Nation Emergency Management, we're responding to emergency events all summer long. We were actually helping with the Stanley Mission evacuation as well. And it's a really good example of an evacuation that went really well when being managed by band and band staff. And then, once getting to the city, then, things get a little more confusing for leadership and also for, everybody supporting. I'm seeing that change quite a bit. As I said, going back to the emergency response coordinators, they are huge voices. They have a lot on their shoulders, but having that dedicated position just to focus on emergency plans. And, I know that tribal councils here in Saskatchewan are very much standing up and taking over a lot of the services that were previously, tasked to the province. And also the Red Cross, we haven't mentioned, being two of the huge service providers nationally, are now standing up because they have these positions that they're taking over transportation. They're taking over registration. So I see the relationship changing as we're building capacity to take on and manage our own events. And I'd like to say that everybody's on board and happy for us, and it's not always the case, right? Because emergencies are big money for a lot of people. And it's not something that I know leadership thinks about during events. They just want to help people, and they want to do it the way they have planned. And that's how it's always been. We just want to be able to manage our own emergencies and manage our own people, and be given the resources to be able to do that is very important.
Yeah, I think that's it. So I don't know. So Fran's been popping in and out here, and it's just the technical challenges of somebody being on the road. Fran, I don't know. Can you hear us now at this time? No. So yeah. Fran is with Alberta, um, Emergency Management Agency, and I know that they've done these practice events where it's been not during an emergency, and it's been an opportunity for the community to actually go through what could happen and what they want to happen. And there's been a lot of support for that in Alberta, pre-planning these kind of events. Michelle, did you want to say something to that?
I just wanted to let you know that there is a couple of questions in the group chat. One is asking about funding for communities. Can I quickly answer that, or?
Yes, yes.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was just kind of reading at the same time. So,
No, I'll read the question out.
okay, perfect.
Yeah, so just so that everybody can see it. So does anybody know of funding availability to communities to do more capacity building planning and maybe emergency exercises to work with wildland fire agencies? So this is coming from our audience, and it's somebody saying, I found several times this summer, even the wildland fire agencies were not aware of what their roles were in supporting Indigenous communities during evacuations or in the times leading up to evacuations. And yeah, I think if you can answer that, Michelle, or even if everybody can have a crack at that one.
Sure. So one of the main funding channels for On Reserve is the Emergency Management Assistance Program. And there is a preparedness piece in there for your planning exercises, for building your emergency response plans. And then looking at, the wildfire agencies, I'd have to go back to the provincial agreement with Indigenous Services Canada and the provincial. I'm not sure, Jane, what province you're from, but if you go back into that agreement, and I would encourage everybody to get to know those agreements and get to know them well, because what I found in those agreements, embedded in them, are training opportunities. So the provinces are supposed to be providing our First Nation communities training opportunities. And I agree with you. A lot of people don't know about those agreements, especially when you're like Paul and you're the boots on the ground. I think the more people read into the agreements, the more capacity it'll help First Nation communities to build as well. So I hope that helped.
Heather Fran says she's on as a guest, but I don't know if that helps because she won't have a mic.
Well, we'll see if our support can help and promote her in, because it's possible to do that. But I'll just give them a second on that. Paul, though, like, I want to come back to you, and I want to come back to you because you're like really in this crux thing in terms of your experience um, of having a lot of firsthand experience as an individual. There's a huge amount of your fire experience, but also your family got evacuated during firefighting, and then you're involved in the community, and then you're involved in the agency, and like there's a lot of different pressures and like aspects for you. And like how does that personal experience um like shape your thoughts on evacuations? That's one of the things, like, and not trying to, when we were talking about this before, it's like the idea that you're still just one individual. It's really hard to be one individual and also to be speaking in a space like this.
Yeah, that's a good question. It has been challenging. Like just going back to when my family was evacuated, it's that same fire that was by Whitefish Lake. It was between Whitefish and Gift Lake, but so both communities got evacuated, and I got sent to the fire as a strike team leader to go look after the crews and work on the fire. And then I got word later on that my kids had been evacuated and their community was evacuated. So I had to keep on working. I had to stay focused on what I was doing. I couldn't, like run off and go make sure. I had to trust the system that my kids were in good hands, and they were. Like they ended up getting taken to High Prairie and staying with their brother. But it is very challenging. Like again, there you get asked by community members what's going on, and like I later on that day I got back to High Prairie after working on the fire all day, and then I went to the place where everybody was evacuated to. It was a sports palace in High Prairie, like as soon as people saw me, like they just came running, literally came running towards me and come ask me a bunch of questions, like things like, their houses get burnt down. Like, is it true that there was an explosion? But all this stuff. Like, it was a little bit overwhelming. But I told them, no, everything's okay. Like, we've got the fire under control, and that seemed to alleviate a lot of the tension that was in the air. And that's what I mean about the communication is important. Like, we need to keep people notified as to what's going on. Because it is highly stressful to be displaced on short notice like that, and to be taken out of your home and go, put in a strange spot and be expected to be okay and calm. So it is challenging.
Heather, can I just add to what Paul said there, just based on one of the findings from the book, and that was the importance of people staying behind in their communities. So lots of times, we hear on the news every single summer about like the bad First Nations people who won't leave their reserve and, are causing huge complications for emergency managers and wildfire response. And what we really found in the research was that always happens. Like, I don't know actually if I've ever heard of an evacuation where people haven't stayed behind in First Nation communities, and that there's lots of knowledge that exists there that should actually be used kind of by local agencies moving forward. And then also those people that stay behind, then lots of them have knowledge, they know about fire, but then they also act as really important conduits of real-time information to people through Facebook and other social media things. Like Paul was saying, they can say, no, the fire hasn't entered the community. No, this hasn't happened. Whereas, wildfire management agencies often, as we've seen, get very overwhelmed with responding to like individualized requests like that. They can issue kind of statements at 10 in the morning or whatever, and maybe later in the day. But I think that we've seen that information needs have really shifted from that, where people want real-time information now. And that's, I think, really where these staying behind people can be quite helpful if it's done in a safe way.
Yeah, if I may, that's a good point that you make, Amy, because at that same time, like, I got asked by a few of the members, like, how come we're not being utilized? Like, we're veteran firefighters. We used to fight fires. Like, how come we're not being used to help our community to, if the fire comes into our community, to try to help fight the fire. So that was a legitimate question that that stuck with me at the time. It makes me wonder why we don't try to tap into the strengths and the skills of the communities.
I just wanted to add a little bit to that piece as well. So in Saskatchewan, when I talk about, building capacity at the band level and really being able to manage your emergency response plan, what I've seen, and going back to Stanley Mission again, is so for the people who did stay back in community, they stayed back because they wanted to help, because they had skills to help. And being in the community, they turned into security for the homes and make sure that everybody's homes were safe. We also had a lot of people who were living on the land. There's a huge change that came through Indigenous Services Canada. 4 years ago, they were not supporting people who were going out to their choppers cabins or, all of their cabins in and around the community. It just wasn't supported. Now we're seeing a lot of people, coming back into the community and needing fuel and needing groceries. So there's another role for community members to be supporting those people out on the land as well, protecting, their traditional cabins and hunting and gathering areas as well. So it's really, it goes back to the progress payment, having the money to support the people, both in cities, on the land, and the hiring of staff who are band members who become staff during emergency events.
Okay, I'm just
Michelle,
wondering, Fran.
Oh, sorry, Michelle, is that forward payment, is that available in all provinces and territories or just Saskatchewan?
I heard the minister speak about it nationally, so she talked about a progress payment nationally. So this is a national program. When don't forget needing to use keywords, right? An imminent threat to a First Nation community, right? Like you're getting that expertise from our wildland guys. Yes, we're in danger. Then you would reach out to Indigenous Services Canada regionally and ask for a progress payment to manage what you need to, right? You're going to be getting buses on standby. You're having staff working overtime. All of those pieces fall together really, really well when you have the funds to actually go towards it and you're not taking from Paul to pay Peter. It's a huge game changer.
Well, that brings me to this thing of, is there more that we can do in terms of awareness for like the fire management agency staff? Because I'm thinking about Paul and Paul, your role where you're out fighting the fire. And this is a challenge. Like you have fire management agency staff who are out fighting the fire, and you know there's whatever pre-work that we can do, and there's engagement that we can do, and maybe sharing information more and stuff like that. But when we're really talking about the people who are out fighting the fire, what is it that they can do that, like, that's, you know, th- there's funding arrangements, and there's involving band and council and all of these exercises. Is there an awareness component to that for the people that are actually firefighters, or is there, I'm going to say that to, is this outside, or is it together? Is it something that, because this was one of the challenges when we're talking about jurisdiction, that you have people who are really busy, engaged fighting the fire, and can they be arranging buses at the same time as they're arranging helicopters? Like, is that an expectation, or are we expecting too much? Or where do we want them to be involved?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, right? Because it is like very, very busy, and everybody. I got to commend our people this summer, especially. Like it is so insanely busy everywhere, and everybody just worked themselves to the bone pretty much. It is tricky because once you're focused on trying to get control of the fire, that's your main goal, to protect human life and communities. You really don't have much time to even actually think about what else you can be doing. But I honestly I can't really answer that in a meaningful way to say that we can be doing other things because we already have so much to do.
Yeah, and no, it's drawing attention to that struggle, and I'm like, involving communities up front and more pre-planning and having people have their own voice here um, is ideal. And I think, Fran, are you on? Are you able to join us now?
Can you hear me?
Oh, we can.
Woohoo!
So it might be a good time to come in and so we've been talking about community of involvement and what's been progressing in this area, and you've been involved in collaborations and having successful collaborations between your agency and communities during evacuations. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I can. So first of all, I apologize for all the issues I've had. So our team, we have 4 field officers and 2 support office staff that we deploy out to all of the events in Alberta on reserve to assist the communities in their evacuation. So when there's non-evacuations, we're spending a lot of time training, and the training has really been beneficial in getting the communities up to speed on what's required and how to go about doing an organized evacuation, as well as tracking your evacuees for numerous reasons. The main one being getting your funding back through the Emergency Management Assistance Program with ISK. But a couple of years ago, there was a big fire that affected peerless trout and a number of communities in that area. And they left very suddenly without any of the basic needs or their go bags or anything. So we worked with ISK in order to set up a necessity station in a conference room at one of the hotels. So we had purchased all of the basic needs that you could possibly think of, and brought them into the conference room, sorted them out, and then we gave the hotel coordinators um, a form that would identify the name, the room number they were in, and they could tick off what they needed. We would fill the bags. They would come pick them up and deliver them to the evacuees in the room. It was so successful. It was a lot of work, but it really limited the amount of resourcing the community had to do to try and accommodate getting basic needs to a lot of the evacuees that left without diapers or, any of shampoos, any of that kind of stuff. So that was a really, really good project that we did. And I'm sure ISK would support another one if we had to, just because of the success we had with it. The only downfall was we were limited in staffing. We have a small team, so in order to pull teams together, it was a struggle. But as we went on, we were able to get some of the evacuees to come in and work with us, and they got paid through the EMAP program. So it was really good. The evacuation plans that the communities have usually identify the hotels that they're going to go to, or the First Nations that they want to work with, in order to do some accommodating for elders or billeting out or such things like that. And this year we're starting a new program, and it's called the Emergency Management Support Team. So we're gathering a database of all the resources in the communities, from security to a DEM that can be deployed, firemen that can be deployed, security that can be deployed. So if nations are looking for additional resources, we can go into that database and find First Nation resources that can deploy out and work with that community under their umbrella. And it worked well last year. We did a number of things with Denetaw, including some help from Tall Cree, and then Denetaw did host the Northwest Territories. So working together and knowing what resources are in the community was really beneficial. So because I've missed most of your conversations, I don't know if I'm on key or off key, but those are kind of the highlights of where we are with AEMA.
I think in a way it's echoing what we're talking about here in terms of identifying what are the supports and what are the processes and what is going on. And I'm going to go into the questions from the audience, and there is a person here who said, I've seen that sometimes it can be problematic when government or an agency provides training for Indigenous communities, as it often doesn't make space for the local way of doing things. Often the training aims to homogenize the way to manage emergency situations, and we can understand how it can help when there's several organizations or jurisdictions working together. So in a stressful situation, how can this be done in a way that makes space for local or Indigenous ways of doing things? And Amy, I think you answered this, but I don't know that you've answered in the chat there, but I don't know that is visible to everybody. So I'm going to kick it over to you and Fran, if you can think about that too.
Yep, I had just said that Paul's actually involved in a project with the Métis National Council, and actually Jane Park, who asked the question earlier, on basically indigenizing ICS training for Métis peoples. So maybe Paul, Paul's probably the one to speak to that better. But that's just an idea of how we can incorporate Indigenous ways into emergency management.
Yeah, it's just that the beginning stages of it. We just began talking about it yesterday, but the hope is to be able to, as you say, have representation from the Indigenous community, to be able to incorporate some of the Indigenous ways of doing and knowing into these training courses, and we'll see how it works out. But I'm looking forward to it.
With the Alberta Emergency Management Agency, our basic courses, not including ISC, are all done with the communities, in the communities, and we adapt to whatever they need. So as we're training, if they say, well, we would do it normally this way, then that's how we work with their emergency plan. We try and fit it in, because there's no plan that is the same across any nation in Alberta. And with ICS Canada, in order to be certified, you have to take the actual ICS Canada training. So there's no way of adjusting it to specific needs. However, I know that my field officers, when they're doing the training, instead of talking about a big wildfire or an event, in order to get people to understand the roles and responsibilities, they'll often do it as planning a powwow. So putting those roles and responsibilities in towards organizing a powwow, and then it seems to turn a light bulb on that, okay, if this is what it is, then in an emergency it would be this. So we try and accommodate those types of scenarios into our training, so that we can hit the Indigenous target and still have them be fully ISC trained.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think the main idea behind it all is that to have an Indigenous presence as the course is being doled out, and having scenarios where you can relate to the Indigenous audience that's going through the course.
Can I just add one last piece? So I just returned last week from the Preparing Our Home in BC, which brings First Nation youth from across Canada. And we have mentors, and we're building capacity from our youth. And the goal is that the youth will go home and, do projects within their communities and build that out actually provincially. So I just want to share something that's so exciting when we talk about, having our space and EOCs and training. This was unveiled actually in British Columbia, and I think it's so fitting. So, it places that importance on our women, our aunties in our communities being such great leaders and role models. You'll also notice the color is the same as the directors, because the importance of, those female spaces being so vital in the EOC as well. So for everybody, aunties coming your way. So it was actually youth who designed the logo, and we had them, all the youth went home with them. So just one great idea of, how communities can move forward. Just have your voice and make sure you're in those important spaces.
Yeah, and now at this point, I just wanted to note that there is a comment about differences between the Métis settlements and First Nations in terms of resources. So that comment's been brought up, but we have time for one last thought, very brief last thought, to go around to everybody. And I think I'm going to come to you first, Amy, if you have a really brief last thought.
Okay, my quick thought is that wildfire management agencies should stop saying that they don't have a role to play in evacuations, because the role is actually major. And I think we've shown that, and there's lots of ways that we can work together to improve these evacuations.
All right, I'll go to Tara.
Thanks, Heather. Echo what Amy just said. But also, it's fantastic to hear about the changes that have been going on that Michelle has talked about. So I'm hoping that we're starting to see those changes across the country, because they'll make a huge difference in terms of communities being prepared, being able to respond, which will have positive impacts on health and well-being, a topic that came up in the chat as well. So yeah, very, very exciting to see some of these positive changes.
All right, and Fran?
I guess what I'd like to say is, as far as the emergency management in Alberta, it's key that everybody in the community is aware of the emergency plan, aware of what their community has been trained on, and to volunteer and be part of that emergency team, because we can never have enough people in the communities to help with the evacuees. And our main objective when there is an emergency is that we would hire as many First Nations people as we can to assist in the event before we go outside to municipalities or other NGOs. So there's lots of room and space for community members to get involved, and we'd certainly like to see that. And all they need to do is contact their director of emergency management, because in Alberta, every community has a director of emergency management in their community. Thank you.
All right, and Paul?
Yeah, thanks, Heather. Yeah, I do echo what everybody's saying, that we do need to start trying to tap into our communities as far as, like I said earlier, the strengths and skills of people, because it is a very traumatic situation for a lot of people once you've been through it. So they become hypersensitive to that, once the event's gone past. So I think that's the time to try to make people aware that they can help somehow, whether it's training to, like what Fran is saying, to be part of the process of helping with the evacuations, or just whatever way they can help. And communications, as always, is very key to the whole operation. And thanks everyone for your time.
All right, and I want to thank you all our panelists. All of you contribute so much in this area, and I just wanted to say that when we were talking about this earlier, one of the things that we wanted to talk about, it's a hard area to talk about, but the idea of this panel was to give people some hope and some learning, and acknowledge that there is some changes and a lot of really good developments that are going on, and also to try and give people some resources for how they can be involved, and how they can help Indigenous communities and give Indigenous communities voice. And I think that that's really one of the important things that we're hearing in this, is that Indigenous communities having voice and having that ability to engage is really important. So thank you all very much. I really appreciate your time, and thank you to our audience. There's been a lot in the chat that I didn't quite catch up on, and the questions as well. And with that, we'll call it a session.
Thanks, Heather.
Bye now.